What's up, guys? I'm Luke,
I'm Namoan.
and today we're going to be talking about the cultural value of film and media, and more specifically, what media and creative content actually teaches about the world, other cultures, and people who live differently than us. Throughout this course, we've watched a wide range of films, documentaries, and other types of media, and we didn't just watch them for entertainment, we broke them down to understand how they communicate deeper ideas. One of the biggest things we realized is that media is not just something we consume passively, but it actually helps shapes how we see the world and how we understand other people and even how we interpret our own experiences.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't realize that when they're watching something, it feels like entertainment, but at the same time, it's teaching you things without even noticing. It shows you how people live, how they communicate, what they value, and what they struggle with. And that's especially important when it comes to people who live differently from us, because most of the time we don't get direct experience with every culture or every perspective. So media ends up being one of the main ways we learn about those differences.
Exactly. And because of that, media plays a huge role in shaping our understanding of the entire world. It could expand our perspective, challenge our assumptions, and help us understand people in ways we wouldn't have been able to otherwise. But also at the same time, it could limit our understanding if we don't think critically about what we're watching.
So the main question we're answering today is, what does media actually teach us about people who live differently from us? And how does that affect the way we understand the world and communicate with others?
And instead of just summarizing specific movies, we're focusing on the bigger ideas of how media influences perception, how it shapes communication, and how it builds or sometimes distorts our understanding of different cultures. So, section one we're going to be talking about is media as a window into other cultures. One of the most important roles of media is that it acts as a window into other cultures. Most people don't have the opportunity to travel the world or directly experience a wide range of cultural environments. Because of that, media becomes one of the main ways people are exposed to different ways of life. When we watch films or documentaries from different countries or about different communities, we start to see how people live and how they interact and also what they prioritize.
And what's interesting is that even small details can teach us something. Things like how people greet each other, how they handle conflict, how families interact, those are all shaped by culture.
And without media, a lot of these differences would remain invisible to us. We would only understand the world from our own perspective.
But media challenges that. It shows us that we consider normal is actually just one version of reality.
And that realization is important because it helps us avoid thinking that our way of living is the only correct way. It opens the door to understanding and accepting differences instead of just judging them.
At the same time, media doesn't just show differences, it also shows similarities. Even when cultures are very different, we still see common human experiences like family, struggle, fear, and connection.
And that balance between difference and similarity is what makes media so powerful. It shows us that people can live very differently but still share the same basic human experiences. And this was shown a lot throughout the course with the different movies we watched. We saw a lot of different communities and people from different backgrounds living same experiences, but just through a different lens. Section 2, Media and How We Perceive Reality.
Another major thing media does is shape how we perceive reality. The way people, cultures, and situations are portrayed in media can influence how we think about them in real life.
And this happens even when we don't realize it. If someone's only exposure to a certain culture comes from media, that media becomes their reference point for understanding it, and that becomes their only sense of knowledge for the specific topic.
Which can be good or bad depending on how accurate that portrayal is.
Exactly. But if media shows culture in a detailed and realistic way, it can increase understanding and reduce stereotypes.
But if it simplifies or exaggerates certain aspects, it can create a misunderstanding or reinforce stereotypes.
So media doesn't just reflect on reality, it also shapes it. But it also depends on how you interpret it in your own eyes.
And that's why it is important to think critically about what we are watching. We have to ask questions like, whose perspectives is being shown, what is being left out, and how might this influence the way that we think.
And that's why I think that this course was good because it wasn't all about just breaking down and summarizing these different movies. It was mainly about how, we would watch the movies and we would break them down in a way that explains how culture is shown throughout, different um, countries, different like ways of living, and not just, specifically exactly what the movie was saying, but we would have to kind of broaden our lens and focus on what the message they were trying to get across. Section 3, cross cultural communication. And this was actually the name of our class. One of the biggest things we focused on in class was cross cultural communication, and media plays a huge role in helping us understand it.
Because communication isn't universal. Different cultures have different ways of expressing meaning.
And this is kind of basically what I just said, but kind of expanding upon it more. Some cultures are more direct, where people say exactly what they mean, but others are more indirect, where meaning is implied through context and tone. And this was shown especially through District 9, the movie that we watched.
And media shows how those differences can lead to misunderstandings.
Two people could both think that they're communicating clearly, but still not understanding each other because they're using different communication styles. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that someone is correct or someone is wrong, or even that someone's using, a better communication style. It all depends person to person, and no one person's communication style is exactly tailored to another person's.
And that's definitely something that we wouldn't be able to notice as easily without media showing it to us.
That's another reason why I like the movies, because you could read a book, all this stuff, but watching the movie gives you a direct you kind of feel like you have a personal connection or relationship with the actors and the people and the things going on in the show or the movie. So that's why I especially like this class. Media basically teaches us to pay attention to more than just what's being said. It teaches us to think about what's being said and what it means to that specific context. Section 4, media builds empathy. One of the most important cultural values of media is its ability to build empathy.
When we watch stories about people from different backgrounds, we're able to see this. We're able to see the world from their perspective.
And it also kind of like shows you how maybe how you're living and how someone else is living, how different that could be. For us, like in one of the movies, it was a little boy and he lost basically his entire family. And, whether that's based on a real story or not, you could still feel and kind of have that connection in there and, be able to be empathetic towards that. Um, that changes a lot how we think. Instead of seeing people as different, we start to understand their experiences.
It makes their struggles feel real, not distant.
And that's really powerful because empathy is what allows us to connect with other people who are different from us.
And without empathy, it's easy to judge or misunderstand others.
But media helps break that down by putting us in someone else's position. Kind of like I said before, watching the movies allows you to put yourself in their shoes other than, watching a book or just talking about it. When you watch, you really get hooked emotionally. So, section 5, limitations of media.
Even though media has a lot of value, it's not perfect.
It can simplify cultures, focus on stereotypes, or only show one perspective, which is not what you want. That's the exact opposite. Because if you watch one movie that's almost a comedy movie that's kind of ragging on, um, a culture, that's gonna change people's perspective. Whether it's a serious movie or not, that's gonna be what you immediately jump to, what you immediately think about when thinking about it in real life. So that's why it's really important on the selection of movie that you watch. You can't just be watching comedy movies. That's gonna, it's gonna change your perspective. You kind of need to focus in on what you're watching specifically.
And when that happens, it actually creates misunderstanding instead of reducing them.
So we have to be aware that media is not the full picture. It's just one version of it.
And that's why it's important to look at multiple perspectives and not just rely on a single.
Okay. So now for our next segment, we're going to be talking about baseball movies because, me and Owen are members of the baseball team and we wanted to make this podcast tailored to that. So one film that really stands out when talking about the cultural value of media is 42, which tells the story of Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in Major League Baseball. But what makes this film important for our discussion isn't just the historical moment, it's how it shows communication under pressure in a deeply divided culture.
Yeah, because the movie isn't just about baseball. It's about how people communicate when there's tension, discrimination, and power imbalance. Jackie Robinson is consistently being disrespected, insulted, and tested, but he's told not to respond aggressively.
And that's where communication becomes really complex. He's being forced into a situation where he has to control his reactions in order to survive and succeed. That's just not a personal decision, it's shaped by the culture around him.
It also shows how language can be used as a weapon. The insults thrown at Robinson aren't just words, they reflect a larger cultural attitudes of the time. And that tells us something important. Communication isn't just neutral, it carries history, power, and meaning.
At the same time, the film shows how communication can create change, though. Branch Rickey, the team executive, communicates differently. He challenges the system, supports Robinson, and uses his position to shift the culture. Now, he was just one of the only people that were doing that. Obviously, there was a few other that supported Robinson in this, or else he wouldn't have been able to make it as far as he did. But there would be people in the stands calling him, slurs. There was his teammates that would call him slurs and stuff, and it's very strong that he was able to get through that such a tough time, and also the communication part of just him controlling his what he said, because at that moment anything that he said or did could have gotten him kicked out of the MLB or even killed.
So, what media teaches us here is that communication can either reinforce inequality or challenge it. It depends on how it's used and who has the power.
And for us as viewers, this film builds empathy. It puts us in Robinson's position, like I was saying before, and forces us to think about how difficult it is to navigate in a system that's so built against you.
So, overall, 42 teaches us that communication is deeply tied to culture and power, and that understanding that connection is key to understanding people who live differently from us.
One other thing I wanted to mention from that is remember the little kid who was calling Jackie Robinson slurs in that?
Yeah.
So it kind of just like brings it to puts it into perspective of how it's kind of crazy. Like there was kids who just whatever they hear from their parents, that's just what they would go out and say, and that's kind of another big thing for this whole communication. Segment two would be A League of Their Own. Another film that shows cultural value is of media is A League of Their Own. On a surface, it's about women playing baseball during World War II, but it actually reveals a lot about gender roles and cultural expectations.
Yeah. And what's interesting is how the players are expected to communicate and behave. They're not just playing baseball, they're expected to act a certain way to fit society's idea of femininity.
Exactly. They're told to be polite, attractive, and emotionally controlled. Even while competing in a professional sport, that creates a tension between their identity as athletes and the cultural expectations placed on them.
And you could see that in how they talk to each other and how they're coached, there's a constant pressure to perform, not just physically, but socially.
I agree. I definitely agree with that. This also shows how communication is shaped by cultural norms. The way these women express themselves is influenced by what society expects from them, even especially their uniform. They had to wear these uniforms that were just absolutely ridiculous for baseball.
It also shows how those expectations can limit people. They're capable athletes, but they're still being judged based on how well they can fit a certain image.
At the same time, the film challenges those norms. As the story progresses, the players become more confident and start to define themselves on their own terms.
So, media here teaches us how culture can shape identity, but also how people can push back against those expectations.
I agree. It also helps us understand what it was like for women at that time period. While we'll never know what it really feels like, it's just something that we couldn't fully grasp without seeing it played out. It doesn't exactly put us in their shoes completely, but it really shows us what that time period was like, especially for these women who they were playing baseball at the time. That wasn't really a normal thing for women, and it was just kind of crazy to see what was being asked of them and how they were kind of being controlled by these people. So this one's going to be about The Sandlot, fan favorite. The last film we'll talk about is Sandlot, which might seem much more lighthearted, but it actually has a lot of cultural value when it comes to communication in social groups.
Yeah, because the movie is really about a group of kids forming a community. And you could see how the communication works within that group.
When the main character joins the group, he doesn't automatically belong. He has to learn how they communicate, what they value, and how they interact with each other.
That's a perfect example of entering a new culture. Even though it's just a group of kids, they have their own rules, language, and expectations.
And my favorite part that showed that this kid was different from the others at the start was when he brought his Babe Ruth baseball to the field.
Yeah, and I mean also another thing where he was trying to fit in was when they were at what was it, the carnival,
Yeah,
like the with the rides, and the one kid brought the can of dip, and he did it just because everyone else was doing it, just trying to fit in with everyone, and then all of them ended up throwing up.
yeah. That's a big part, especially because then they think he's like them, and they were all throwing up. So he was he looked normal, he fit the part. Um, But going back, if you don't understand those, it's easy to feel excluded. This shows how communication is tied to belonging.
It also shows informal communication. The way the kids talk, joke, and interact is very different from a formal conversation, but it's just as important.
And through that, we see how identity is shaped by these social groups. The main character changes as he becomes a part of the group.
So, what media teaches us here is that even small communities have their own cultures, and understanding those cultures is key to communication.
It also shows that connection and belonging are universal experiences, even if they happen in different ways. For the next segment, and this is going to be an extended segment, it's going to be The Chosen, TV show about Jesus and his disciples. So, one of the strongest examples of cultural value of media that connects directly to our class discussion is The Chosen. When we think about the question, what does media and creative content teach us about the world, other cultures, and people who live differently from us? This show actually gives us a real detailed example of how culture shapes communication, belief, and interpretation. Even though The Chosen is a historical and religious drama, which what makes it useful for us is the discussion is not just the story it tells, but how it shows different people interacting within completely different cultural systems. Every conversation, every conflict, and every misunderstanding is influenced by identity, authority, and belief systems that are deeply rooted in that society. So instead of just watching events happen, we're actually seeing how people from different cultural backgrounds interpret the same reality in completely different ways.
Yeah. And that connects directly to one of the main ideas we've talked about all semester, which is that communication is not just about language, it is about interpretation. The chosen, in the chosen, people are consistently communicating, but they're not always understanding each other the way that we might expect. And that's not because the dialogue is unclear, it's because everyone is interpreting meaning through their own cultural lens. So, what media teaches us here is that misunderstanding isn't always a failure of communication. Sometimes it is just a difference in perspective.
And what was your favorite part from that show so far? Because we're actually watching it together. We have like 2 episodes left. But Owen, what was your favorite part so far?
One of my favorite parts was probably all the miracles of Jesus, obviously, they're all very significant. I think one of my favorite ones was when he healed the paralytic in front of like thousands of people, or maybe the Sermon at the Mount when he preached in front of, I think it was 4,000 or 5,000 people.
Yeah, that's definitely good. My favorite would actually be something different. It would be when what's his name when Nicodemus wasn't able to follow him and Jesus and his disciples. That was my favorite part because you could see the regret and almost a look of fear in his eyes when he didn't, and he realized immediately that that was what he should have done. All of this is a really important takeaway for this class because it shifts how we think about people who live differently from us. Instead of assuming confusion or disagreement is personal, we start to see that it often comes from cultural differences. For example, in the show, you have Roman officials, Jewish religious leaders, and everyday working class people all interacting in the same environment. Even though they may share geography or language, they don't share the same values, beliefs, or expectations. And that changes everything about how communication works.
Right, because communication is always tied to power and structure. In the show, when someone in authority speaks, their words carry more weight, not just because of what they say, but because of who they are. So even the same sentence can have completely different meaning depending on who is saying it and who is receiving it. And that's something media shows really clearly. Communication is not equal. It's shaped by hearsay, culture, and social roles.
You could see this in a lot of big parts with like the Roman leaders. Um, what's the main Romans leader?
Quintus.
Yeah. So you could see um, kind of how like people communicate differently to Quintus as they will to other people. That's just another big part. Power plays a huge role in communication. When we connect all of this back to our class, it helps us understand real world communication too in everyday life. We also adjust how we speak depending on who we are talking to teachers, friends, parents, authority figures. But The Chosen exaggerates that in a historical context so we can actually see it happening more clearly. And what media is teaching us that communication is always influenced by context. You can't separate what is said from the environment that it's said in.
Another major theme the show highlights is how belief systems affect communication. People don't just respond to information, they respond based on what they already believe to be true. So even when a message is clear, it can be interpreted completely different depending on someone's worldview. And that's a really big concept in cross-cultural communication because in real life we often assume that if something is said clearly, it will be understood clearly. But media shows us that's not always the case.
Exactly. I agree with that a lot. Um, and also, what's interesting is that The Chosen lets us see multiple perspectives at the same time. We're not just following one character while we're mainly following Jesus, but we also see other characters and how other different groups interpret the same events differently. Some people, when they see what Jesus is doing, they want to join him, and others want to kill him. This is really important for understanding because for the culture understanding the cultural value of media because it teaches us that reality is not experienced the same way by everyone. Two people could be in the same situation, hear the same words, and walk away with completely different interpretations based on their cultural background.
And that connects directly to something that we've talked about earlier in the class, which is indirect and direct communication styles. In the show, some characters communicate very directly, especially those in positions of authority. Their communication is structured, intentional, and often tied to rules or systems. Other characters communicate in more relational or indirect ways, relying more on tone, context, or shared understanding. And when those two styles interact, misunderstandings naturally happen.
And what media teaches us through that is that there's no correct way to communicate universally. Everywhere is going to be different. There are just different systems that evolved based on culture, environment, and social structure. So when we watch The Chosen, we're not just seeing a historical story, we're seeing communication systems collide. And that's where a lot of real life misunderstandings come from too. Not from people being careless, but from people using different frameworks to interpret meaning.
Another important layer Another important layer the show brings out is nonverbal communication. A lot of meaning in the show is carried through tone, facial expression, silence, and reaction rather than just spoken dialogue. And that's something we also see in real cross cultural communication. In some cultures, silence is meaningful. In others, it's uncomfortable. In some cultures, eye contact shows respect. In others, it can be seen as confrontational. So, media helps us realize that communication is not just verbal, it's also deeply nonverbal and contextual.
And once we start seeing that, it changes how we interpret real people too. We become more aware that what someone says might not fully reflect on what they mean, and what they don't say can also be just as important. So, in terms of cultural value, The Chosen teaches us how to slow down and pay attention to layers of meaning instead of just surface level dialogue.
It also helps build empathy, which is one of the biggest impacts of media in general. Because when we watch characters from different backgrounds trying to communicate, we start to understand why they act the way they do. Even when we don't agree with them, we can understand their reasoning. And that's a huge part of cross cultural communication, understanding before judging.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Um, Overall, what The Chosen teaches us is that around the world and other cultures, is communication is never just about words, which we've talked about over and over again. It's about belief, identity, culture, and power all working together at the same time, and media helps us see that more clearly than in real life sometimes. because it slows down everything and lets us observe interactions we would normally miss.
And that connects directly back to the big question of the assignment. Media and creative content don't just entertain us, they teach us how people live differently, how they communicate differently, and how culture shapes everything from behavior to belief.
To wrap everything up, the main idea we've been working through in this podcast is the cultural value of media and creative content, specifically what it teaches us about the world, other cultures, and people who live differently from us. And after looking at the different examples, like The Chosen, 42, and other media we've discussed in class, one thing becomes really clear. Media is not just entertainment, it's a form of communication that shapes how we understand reality, and what we see in media directly influences how we interpret people, cultures, and situations in real life. Even when we don't realize it, we are constantly learning from what we watch.
Yeah, and I think the biggest takeaway from everything we talked about is that communication is way more complex than just language. It's not just about what people say, it's about how they say it, why they say it, and what cultural background they're coming from when they say it. And once you start looking at media through that lens, you realize that a lot of misunderstandings in real life aren't just actually about disagreement, they're about interpretation. People are often using completely different cultural systems to understand the same message.
Exactly. And media helps us see that more clearly because it gives us access to the perspectives we normally wouldn't experience. We get to see how different people live, how they communicate, and how they make sense of the world around them. That exposure is really important because without it, it's easy to assume that your own way of thinking or communicating is the default and the only way. But media challenges that by showing us that there are multiple valid ways of interpreting reality.
And another big thing that we talked about is how culture affects communication styles. Some people are more direct, some are more indirect, some rely heavily on verbal communication, others rely more on tone, body language, or context. And none of those are wrong, they're just different. But when those styles mix, misunderstandings can happen really easily. So, media teaches us to slow down and pay attention to those differences instead of assuming everyone communicates the same way.
And I think that's where the real cultural value of media comes in. It doesn't just show us stories, it helps us build awareness and empathy. When we watch characters from different backgrounds, we start to understand why they think the way they do. Even if we don't fully agree with them, we can understand their perspective, and that's a really important part of cross cultural communication understanding before judging.
Yeah, and it also shows us that communication is not neutral. It's shaped by power, identity, and culture. Who is speaking, who is listening, and what social context they're in all affects how the message is received. So, media helps us see that communication is always layered. There's what is said, what is meant, and what is understood. And those three things aren't always the same.
I agree. So overall, what we've learned from this class and from analyzing media is that the world is full of different ways of communicating and interpreting reality. And instead of seeing those differences as confusion or conflict, media helps us see them as cultural diversity. It shows us that people aren't just different for no reason, they're shaped by their environments, histories, and social systems.
And that's really the main point we want to leave with. Media and creative content teach us that understanding other people requires more than just listening to their words. It requires understanding their context, their culture, and their perspective.
At the end of the day, media doesn't just reflect the world, it helps us understand it. It gives us a chance to step outside of our own experience and see how other people live, think, and communicate. And that's what makes it so valuable.
So, when we go back to the original question, what does media teach us about the world and people who live differently from us? The answer is that it teaches us perspective. It teaches us that there isn't just one way to see the world, and there isn't just one way to communicate within it.
And if there's one final takeaway, it's that better communication starts with understanding differences and not ignoring them. So, guys, that's all we have today. Thank you for listening to our first episode of our podcast. I'm Luke,
And I'm Owen.
and we'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you.